For those of you who don't have PowerPoint, you can either stand up for the opening remarks, or you can sit, whatever you're more comfortable with. Next, I want to ask a question to Dr. Jessie Fields. I want to ask a question to Dr. Jessie Fields. Dr. Fields, from your experience in working in low-income communities as an activist and from your work with the organization Open Primaries, you really do bring a unique perspective to our discussion. And we know the problem, and I think Steve's really presented important data to us. How do you think we can actually increase voter participation?
Thank you, Esther, and thank you, everyone, and thanks to Citizens Union for organizing today's event and to everyone for being here. So I think has been mentioned, looking at the state of our political process and its relationship to voters is very, very timely. It's so timely today, right now, after the election. So I serve on the board of directors of Open Primaries, and I just want to thank John Updike, who's the president and founder of Open Primaries, and Jeremy Gruber from Open Primaries, and Kathy Stewart with independentvoting.org for their work in raising these important issues about our elections and about voters, and for being here today. So I am a medical doctor. I'm a community organizer and a political activist, and I have worked in Brooklyn and currently for the last probably 20 years in the Harlem community as a physician and as an activist. And throughout my years of activism, it's been deeply important to me to bridge the ongoing racial, social, and ideological divides in our society. A towering leader who brought together a movement that inspired Americans of different races and different walks of life was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1965, at the end of the historic march from Selma to Montgomery, Dr. King spoke about the centrality of the right to vote. He said that the denial of the right to vote is at the very origins of the root cause of racial segregation in the South. Then he went on to discuss the populist movement in the post-Civil War period and how poor black and white farmers were brought together. But, Dr. King explained, this alliance was destroyed by white Southern Bourbon elites, by Jim Crow laws, and violent intimidation. So the quest for a more perfect democracy continues to this day. And I believe that the essence of voting rights and the core value of the fight for voting rights, not only for black people, but for all people, is that we all must have the right to vote in all phases of the election process, no matter our race, our creed, color, or party affiliation, or no party affiliation, and that no one should be required to join a political party as a precondition for voting. And it's never really made sense to me that the political parties get to decide who can vote and who cannot vote, who is on the ballot and who's not on the ballot, who can appear in the televised debates and who does not appear in the debates, and what and how issues are brought forward in the public dialogue. Why do the political parties get to make all those critical decisions? To the basic question of how do we increase voter participation and make elections more competitive, my most basic answer is that having a system with no barriers to voting is a way to increase participation. Let's get rid of the barriers to voting, and that's why I believe that nonpartisan elections in which all voters can vote in every round of voting is a critical next step in increasing voter participation. So allowing all registered voters to vote among all the candidates in the first round, and then the top two vote getters going on to the general election, creates more competitive elections. This is top two nonpartisan open primaries. So it's a simple equation here. Competitive elections give you a shot at increasing turnout, and nonpartisans is a way to increase turnout and increase competition. And I'm sure many people here were involved and remember that when Michael Bloomberg served as mayor, there were several attempts to bring this reform of nonpartisan elections to New York City. Bloomberg was first elected mayor of New York City in 2001 with his margin of victory on the Independence Party line. After the election, he kept his promise to the Independence Party to convene a charter revision commission on nonpartisan elections, and after an attempt in 2002 that failed to put the question on the ballot, in 2003, the commission placed a referendum for nonpartisan elections on the ballot. And as many people in this room know, it was an intense battle in which the political parties and almost all of the New York City political establishment vehemently, and I mean vehemently, opposed this reform. In a very low turnout election, the referendum lost by 31% voting in favor, but the referendum lost. So in New York State, there are 3.2 million independent, third-party, and unaffiliated voters who are shut out of voting in the primaries. In the 2016 presidential primary in New York State, only 19.7% of eligible voters cast a ballot. Many voters who wanted to participate were disenfranchised. 50% of millennials and many young people in general are independents. Many of them worked on the Senator Bernie Sanders campaign, but when they went to the polls in New York to vote, when they went to the polls all over New York State to vote for the candidate that they had been canvassing for, phone calling for, and petitioning for, they were turned away and not allowed to vote. Because of this experience, open primaries went from an obscure issue that most people in New York didn't understand to an issue that young people were speaking about and giving voice to because they found themselves locked out in this very important election. And Senator Sanders himself was forced to publicly address this issue and to speak about the unfairness of closed party primaries and people being shut out of voting. So nationally, the closed presidential primaries cost taxpayers $250 million and excluded 26.3 million voters. This is the biggest form of voter suppression in the country. So I practice medicine and have for many years as a primary care physician in Harlem and in the Congressional District of Harlem, which is now numbered the 13th CD, which includes parts of the Bronx. And since 1944, when a congressional district was placed in Harlem, until now, until November 2016, that is for the last 72 years, Harlem has had only 2 congressional representatives. Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was first elected congressman to represent Harlem in 1944, and Charles Rangel, who was the Harlem congressman from 1971 to this year, to 2016. He just retired, and the seat was won by Adriana Espaillat. Whatever your view of these particular elected officials, it's an undeniable reality that a community that has the highest rates of asthma in the country, some of the most entrenched poverty, and worsening access to truly affordable housing, among other issues, that this community has not had a way to demand accountability from those elected to serve it, and has been politically marginalized, as many low-income communities have been marginalized by one-sided elections with low voter turnout. So let me just say a word about the question of nonpartisan elections and communities of color, because the main argument that's put forward against open primaries and nonpartisan elections, and that's used against nonpartisans, is that it would disempower people of color. That is a false argument. Of the 26.3 million Americans that were shut out of voting in the 2016 presidential primary, it's estimated that there were 2 million African American independent voters who live in a closed primary state and were barred from voting. So top 2 nonpartisan elections passed in California in 2010, so we have a real case study, if you will, of nonpartisan elections in California. It was passed in 2010 by the voters, by a voter referendum, and it has been good for minority voters and for all the voters of California. African American representation in the California legislature has increased significantly. Independents can now vote in all rounds of voting, including the growing number of Latino and African American independents, and a robust nonpartisan public primary that we just had, from which the top 2 vote getters from that nonpartisan primary were women of color. They were both women of color, and California is sending an African-American woman, Kamala Harris, to the United States Senate. So a New York election is won almost exclusively, it's secured again and again by simply winning the primary. So it's no accident that voter turnout and participation in New York elections is so low. Nonpartisan elections sets a context and a whole new way of doing politics. So if we really want to bring people together and increase voter participation, we have to dismantle the structures that keep people apart. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.